Under the eerie glow of a midnight moon at their camp in South Africa, the 92nd conducted a melancholy ceremony, entering a flag decorated with the figure 92nd into the red African dirt, burying it as if they would a fallen soldier. All the officers of the regiment had walked behind it as it was carried to the grave, resplendent in full Highland dress as chief mourners. After a funerary oration by the colonel of the 15th Hussars, 3 volleys were fired over the grave, and the haunting strains of a piper's lament echoed across the African veldt. The following day, the regiment was no longer to be the 92nd Highlanders, but was to be merged with the 75th Stirlingshire Regiment of Foot to become simply the Gordon Highlanders. That same night, many leagues away in Malta, the 75th had engaged in a similar act of remembrance for their regiment, which was unlike the Gordons, due to lose much of its heritage. They fashioned a Roman altar at their garrison in Floriana and inscribed it, "Here lies the poor 75th, but under God's protection there rise again in kilt and hose a glorious resurrection, for by the transformation powers of parliamentary laws they go to the bed 75th and rise the 92s." Seeing as the 75th Regiment came to form a battalion of the Gordons, it is only fair we give a brief overview of the regiment. Raised by the son of the famous Ralph Abercrombie, Colonel Robert Abercrombie in Stirling, it was recruited for service in India as the 74th Highland Regiment of Foot, and was in the pay of the East India Company. It fought in India during the 3rd and 4th Anglo-Mysore Wars, most notably forming the storming party at the siege of Seringapatam. The regiment saw little of the Napoleonic Wars, apart from a brief incursion into Calabria, Italy, under the notorious Lord William Bentinck. The 75th went to Africa in the 1830s and fought in the 6th Hussar Wars, before deploying to India for the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Notably conducting a heroic bayonet charge at the siege of Delhi. In 1862, it gained the denotation of Stirlingshire, and went on to deployments in Gibraltar, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Cape Colony. The regiment had 3 Victoria Cross recipients, all from the Indian Mutiny, all 3 in fact for rescuing fellow wounded soldiers under fire. The next morning, when the Gordons dug up the flag, it had been inscribed, "Nor deed yet." Indeed, the regiment was anything but deed, and was to continue for a further 113 glorious years of exemplary soldiering across the world. With the regimental colours of the 92nd laid up in St Giles Cathedral, Edinburgh, by the then Duke of Cambridge, the new regiment now comprised 3 battalions, with the 1st battalion being the former 75th Stirlingshire Foot, the 2nd battalion comprising the all 92nd Gordon Highlanders Regiment of Foot, and the 3rd battalion was based at Castle Hill Barracks in Aberdeen as the Royal Aberdeenshire Highland Militia. The Gordon Highlanders were also responsible for 5 battalions of the Rifle Volunteer Corps across the northeast, a reservist force at that point autonomous from the army. In 1882, the 1st battalion arrived in Alexandria, Egypt, under Sir Garnet Wolseley for the opening stages of the Anglo-Egyptian War. With the British heavy cavalry having cleared the way before them, it fell to General Hamsley, 3rd Highland Brigade comprising the Gordon Highlanders, the Black Watch, the Cameron Highlanders, and the Highland Light Infantry, to, along with 2 other brigades, storm the hastily assembled Egyptian defence outside of Alexandria. Wolseley conducted a night march up to the enemy lines, forming up under the cover of darkness before launching a brutal frontal assault on the Egyptians, with the Highland Brigade in the centre. The Sudanese soldiers opposing the Gordons were weary from having been stood to all night previously, and were horrified to be snapped into consciousness by the screams of charging Gordon Highlanders, bayonets glinting in the sun of the desert, the pipes playing behind the advancing Highlanders as hundreds of kilted warriors made short work of the African soldiery, routing them in under 20 minutes. The Gordons lost only 5 of their men, the British losing some 57 altogether, with the Egyptians losing around 2,000 men in the close quarters fighting and their attempts to flee. The regiment remained in Africa to fight in the Sudan for the Mahdist War, fighting at El Teb and Tamai, before forming part of the Gordon Relief Column to rescue General Charles Gordon, besieged by some 50,000 Sudanese Mahdists at Khartoum. The column defeated a Sudanese force at the famous Battle of Abu Klea. However, the defeat had spurred the besiegers into storming the city, where Gordon, along with his small garrison, was massacred. The Gordon Highlanders, amongst others, arrived only 2 days late. The 1st Battalion then embarked for Malta before India, and then in 1895 took part in the Chitral expedition, relieving a force of Indian troops under Captain Charles Townshend, surrounded by Afghan tribesmen. The Gordons distinguished themselves alongside their fellow countrymen in the King's Own Scottish borderers at the Battle of Malaccan Pass, scaling steep hills under rifle fire and intentionally dislodged boulders to take the positions, and in time advanced to relieve the fort at Chitral. The following year, a handful of Gordons were part of a Highland company of mounted infantry formed to serve in the Second Matabele War in South Africa. 1897 saw the Gordon Highlanders take part in the Tira campaign, where they would make their name at the Battle of Dargai Heights. With the fall of the Khyber Pass on the Indian northwestern frontier with Afghanistan to Afridi tribesmen, Afghans had begun swarming into northern India and looked poised to attack Peshawar. Amongst the first obstacles the British force sent to subdue these tribesmen were the heights of Dargai, 6,500 feet in some places, and held by Orakzai tribesmen. With very little cover and a winding track upon which to advance, on the 20th of October 1897, Major General Yeatman Biggs ordered the first wave to attack the heights, sending the Dorset, Derbyshire and Gurkha regiments. They attacked up these heights for 4 hours with very courageous charges and efforts made, but they were not able to make progress over much of the open ground about halfway up. Now the Gordon Highlanders were ordered into the fray and advanced up approaches littered with the dead and wounded of their English and Nepali comrades, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Matthias. Determined to show the English and Gurkhas how it should be done, they grimly advanced up the heights, and the Dorsets and Derbys, licking their wounds but soon perking up to provide their Scottish brothers covering fire. With reformed Gurkhas ready to go in with them, Matthias proclaimed to his men somewhat laconically, "Highlanders, the General says the position to be taken at all costs. The Gordons will take it." Where previous attacks had gone wrong was that they had advanced in small units and lacked momentum. So the Gordons went forth, Gurkhas and Sikhs not far behind, as one battalion, pipers playing the iconic Cock of the North as they dashed from cover around the open ground and clambered up to the summit. The Afghan tribesmen unleashed heavy fire on the advancing Gordons, downing an officer almost instantly and wounding many others, including Piper George Finlater, the son of an Aberdeenshire miller. Piper Finlater felled by a wound to the left foot and a broken right ankle, crawled to the cover of a rock, and according to legend began to play the regimental march Cock of the North. However, Finlater had decided to play the more appropriate tune, the Hawes of Cromdale, harking back to the Battle of Cromdale in 1690, when a wounded Jacobite piper had likewise taken cover and played the bagpipes for his comrades, and inspiring a ballad by James Hogg in his Jacobite Reliques, from where the clan Gordon were mentioned. The MacDonalds they returned again, the Camerons did their standards join, the Macintosh played a bloody game upon the halls of Cromdale, the Gordons boldly did advance, the Frasers fought with sword and lance, the Grahams they made the heaths to dance upon the halls of Cromdale. Finlater returned to our Isles a hero to the British public, and was personally decorated his Victoria Cross by Queen Victoria. He was heaped with public donations, sets of bagpipes, and even a proposal of marriage. He toured for several years playing his bagpipes for large crowds before becoming a tenant farmer in Aberdeenshire, raising a large family. He re-enlisted at the start of the Great War, serving as Pipe Major to the 9th Battalion Gordon Highlanders, fighting at Lewes before becoming invalid. He continued to farm back at Fort Glen, serving as the Turf Pipe Band Pipe Major, dying in 1942. But the attack was not yet over, and the Gordons were still surging up the hill to the elation of a certain Lieutenant Tillard, trapped in his position from their previous attacks. He became overcome with emotion as he heard the Highlanders approach him. The scene makes me shake with excitement even now. The Gordons, pipers playing and men cheering, never stopped or wavered, although many of them were down. It was one wild continuous rush of men, all eager to get to the enemy. The sight was magnificent, and the excitement so intense that I for one, although I was shouting at the top of my voice, felt tears springing up into my eyes and could not keep them back. Huns, Gurkhas and Sikhs vied for who would summit the heights first, the Gorns taking the honour but struck a friendship with a plucky Highland inhabiting folk, the Gurkha Rifles, that would for last many years. The heights were taken, the day was won by the Gorns, who were, yet again, following the Battle of Waterloo, immortalised in the romantic public memory for their truly heroic actions, bringing fame and glory to both their regiment and Scotland. The Gordons gained another VC recipient that day, Private Edward Lawson, who rescued an injured officer under heavy fire, whilst one of the battalion's senior officer, Major McBean, was seriously wounded, leading the charge. After this, the Gordon Highlanders returned to the UK, where they were met by a huge crowd and a hero's welcome in Liverpool, and in Edinburgh, a squadron of Scots Greys were required to clear a way for them. Through the streets, such was the triumphant throng that awaited them, having been abroad for about 16 years. At the outbreak of the Second Boer War, both battalions of the regiment departed for South Africa in 1899, where they both suffered heavy casualties at the hands of the Boer commandos. The 2nd Gordons were formed under Sir George White's Natal Field Force and fought their first engagement at Eilenschlachte, advancing on the right under an old chestnut from the previous part of the Gordon story, the now Lieutenant Colonel Dick Cunningham. Scrambling up a steep slope in the rain and under sweeping Boer fire, the Gordons were also being pestered by enemy artillery. During the attack, Cunningham received 2 bullet wounds and fainted, and with the accurate rifle fire, the Boer half of their officers went down, dead and wounded, causing the assault to waver. Colonel Hamilton, in charge of all in the infantry in the attack, including 2 other regiments, the Manchesters and the Devons, and an old Gordon Highlander himself, now took personal control of the situation and ordered his men to fix bayonets, whilst the drum major sounded the charge, which was echoed by the bugles of the Devons, and the Gordons took the hill, roaring "Manjuba! Manjuba!" remembering their heroic but doomed last stand some years earlier at the hands of the Boers. They avenged their ancestors, the 92nd, and slaughtered the Boers who did not flee. Only 3 officers of the battalion came out the other end, not killed or wounded. 2 VCs were awarded, and Corporal Piper MacLeod, Light Piper from later, though wounded in this case in the arm, continued to play the bagpipes till they were wrecked by bullets. Sir Ian Hamilton would go on to command the Home Army in World War I, and then to command the failed Gallipoli campaign, then becoming the president of the Scottish Associations of the British Legion, and made extensive efforts to repair Anglo-German relations throughout the interwar period. The 1st Gordons met a less glorious fate at the Battle of Magenfontein. A few months later, thrown into the fray of a poorly planned battle which saw General Wauchop's Highland Brigade severely mauled by the Boer resistance and forced to retreat, during which the Gordons' CO, Lieutenant Colonel Downsman, was mortally wounded. Trying to rally his men, Captain Towes gained a VC for rescuing his commanding officer. In the early months of the following year, Lieutenant Colonel Cunningham was killed at a desperate action on Wagon Hill, and the 2nd Gordons suffered heavy casualties during the battle, but with the help of the Devons, saw the Boers off. The 1st Battalion, however, played an instrumental role in returning the British line back its glory, charging the enemy at Paardeberg, having crawled some distance in the rain on their stomachs, causing the enemy to surrender. The 1st Gordons served with distinction at Houtneck, where a small band of 12 Gordons and 10 Kitchener horse submitted to Mount Tabor, only to find themselves at point-blank range of some 150 German mercenaries. Captain Towles refused to surrender and led a valiant bayonet charge into their midst, in return being blinded by a shot across both eyes, but driving off the numerically superior enemy, who were startled by the sheer courage of the Highlanders. Towles received a VC for his efforts, presented by Queen Victoria herself, who is said to shed tears whilst pinning the medal on him. The 1st Gordons performed gallantly again at Dorncop, where the Boers had burnt the grass to blacken it, thus making the khaki tunics of the British Army stand out. Nevertheless, the Gordons advanced steadily through the withering fire, with one observer noting, "You could not have detected the least trace of anxiety or concern in any of them. The front rank, when the order to advance was given, stepped down with a swing of the kilt, and a swagger that only a Highland regiment has. Steady on the left, they took their dressing as they reached the flat. Someone sang out, 'When under fire, wear a cheerful face,' and the men laughingly passed the word along." It was a textbook assault by the British, a steady advance, exchange of riflery, and then a ferocious bayonet charge, which cleared the Boer positions in what was one of the last set-piece battles of the war. Both battalions continued fighting in minor skirmishes at Krugersdorp, Rookie Kopiez, Van Wyksvij, Spitzkop, and others until Naboomspit, at a train carrying a small detachment of 23 men of the 92nd Gordons was ambushed by 150 Boers. The last surviving 4 Gordons in open ground fought until 3 were killed and the 4th was wounded. When the Boers asked him why they had not surrendered, the last survivor replied, "Why, man? We are the Gordon Highlanders." Upon hearing of this in a telegram report, King Edward VII replied, "Very pleased to hear of the bravery of the Gordon Highlanders, proud to be their colonel-in-chief." When the Great War broke out, the 1st Gordons disembarked at Boulogne as part of the 3rd Division, suffering heavy losses at Le Cateau, whilst the 2nd Gordons and the 7th Division landed at Zeebrugge. Both these regular battalions suffered horrendous losses in the early stages of the war, the first being annihilated at Calais. The Gordons fought at Neuve-Chapelle, where 2 of their battalions lost their commanding officers, Vestibert and Luz, whilst 7 new battalions of Gordons were raised back home to be sent to the front. Every Gordon battalion fought at the wasteful slaughter that was the Battle of the Somme, taking horrific casualties at Mehmet's Wood, where they were required to take 3 consecutive lines of German trenches who demanded gallons of blood for every clod of earth. The Gordon Highlanders saw action at Vimy Ridge, Bullecourt, Ypres and Cambrai in 1917, and the following year the 2nd Gordons were sent to Italy to help shore up their front after being savaged by the Austrians at Caporetto. The other battalions saw brutal combat at the 2nd Battle of the Somme in 1918, and one action saw the 5th Gordons lose 22 officers and 560 other ranks. Of particular note was the action of Lieutenant Kerr, which he was awarded a Victoria Cross. At St. Quentin, 1918, with all his men wounded, manned Vicker's machine gun, holding up an enemy assault, resorting to his revolver when the Germans charged the position with fixed bayonets. Despite now suffering from gas poisoning too, he only surrendered once all his ammunition was spent after the position was overrun. He had held up some 500 Germans for over 3 hours and was one of 100 VC recipients to escort the gun carriage carrying the unknown soldier to his tomb in Westminster Abbey. When the armistice was eventually signed, some 28,000 Highlanders and 1,000 officers had died. Gaining 65 battle honours, the Gordon Highlanders formed part of the Army of Occupation immediately following the war and served postings in Ireland, Constantinople, Egypt, India, Gibraltar and Malaysia, the 2nd Battalion remaining there till the arrival of the Japanese army in 1942. 1st and the 5th Gordons had their baptism of fire for the 2nd World War as part of the 51st Highland Division, conducting a brave but doomed fighting retreat from the Maginot Line in 1940 and making a last stand at St. Valery, where they were surrounded, cut off from the sea and eventually forced to surrender. The 4th and 6th Battalions managed to escape at Dunkirk. The 2nd Gordons meanwhile served bravely in Singapore against the Japanese, but were likewise forced into surrendering and compelled to work on the Burma-Siam Railway. Despite this less than glorious start to the war, both the 1st and 2nd Battalions were reformed back in the UK, with the 1st Gordons redeeming themselves alongside the rest of the 51st Highland Division, serving in North Africa, where they saw fierce fighting at El Agheila and Burat, and being the first to enter Tripoli in 1943. They moved on to Sicily later that year, fighting at Vizzini and Sefero, before being recalled to Britain to prepare for the Normandy landings. The 6th Gordons, however, remained in the Italian theatre, landing at Taranto and partaking in the heavy fighting at Anzio. At Monte Cassino, Private George Mitchell won the Regiment a Victoria Cross by carrying out a lone bayonet charge at a German machine gun position, shooting one enemy and bayoneting the other, allowing his platoon to continue their stalled assault, but soon came under fire from 2 well-entrenched German sections. Firing his rifle at the hip, Mitchell charged forward again, with the survivors of his section following behind, and took the enemy position, killing 6 and capturing 12. However, the unit came under fire again at close range from a 3rd position, and Mitchell assaulted the position alone and killed the crew, now facing small arms fire from in-depth positions, and he had exhausted his ammunition. He once again led an assault on the enemy position, forcing them to surrender. However, one of the German prisoners picked up a rifle and shot Private Mitchell through the head. The Gordons in Italy pushed through to Rome and had a number of smaller actions until the end of the war. All the while, the 8th and 9th Gordons had been serving in the Far East, repurposed as armoured and artillery units respectively, seeing action at Mektilia and Kohima. 51st Highland Division landed in Normandy, seeking to avenge their honour lost in the Battle of France, and performed well at Touffreville, Caen, Evelacy, where they laid waste to many German tanks, Caumont and Le Havre, amongst many other hard-fought battles. The Gordons crossed the Rhine amidst bitter fighting and incurred many casualties as the Germans fought to defend their homeland, but ultimately the 51st won back their honour and advanced into Germany, where the Gordons took up occupation duties in Lubeck and Bremerhaven, where they remained until 1950. The war had cost them some 2,500 lives, still a considerable amount all things considered. After the war, the battalions were amalgamated into one, simply the 1st Battalion Gordon Highlanders, in 1948 at Essen in Germany. The Gordons were sent to Malaya in 1951 to quell the terrorists there, serving well over a large stretch of territory, conducting many successful raids on enemy camps. Following this, the regiment performed a tour of duty in Cyprus, which was heating up, requiring them to carry out riot control operations and search and destroy missions. They returned in the early 70s as part of the UN peacekeeping force. In the meantime, they deployed to Kenya for the Mau Mau uprising, and then to Swaziland to put down a mutiny of the King's African Rifles, before being sent to Borneo, where the conflict with Indonesia arose. The Gordon Highlanders served multiple tours in Northern Ireland, losing several men in the fighting there, including an incident with a booby-trapped house. They undertook 5 tours in all, 1972, 73, 75, 79, and an 89 tour of Belfast. The Gordons were the last British battalion to serve in 28 Anzac Brigade in Singapore when the defence agreement ended. They were also among the last British forces stationed in Berlin, where they developed an excellent rapport with the local populace, and following the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, a good relationship with the Russian soldiers stationed there too. They were the only British troops to be awarded freedom of the borough of Shattelenburg. Much to the dismay of all Highlanders, on the 17th of September 1994, with exactly 200 years of Gordon Highlander history clocked in, they were amalgamated with the Queen's Own Highlanders, themselves already merger of the Seaforth and Camerons, to form simply the Highlanders in a ceremony at Edinburgh Dreghorn Barracks, marking a black day in Scottish military history, as 3 of its finest regiments were simply merged together into one, causing righteous uproar amongst families and ex-soldiers across Scotland and the UK. The Highlanders took it on the chin, however, and served tours in Northern Ireland and then, in 2003, Bosnia. Yet another blow was dealt when this regiment was reduced to a battalion within the large Royal Regiment of Scotland, becoming merely 4 Scots. though retaining the Highlanders as a subtitle and wearing a blue hackle. The regiment wears the government pattern tartan for their dress kilt, though the pipe band wears air-hacked tartan. Recruiting from across the Hebrides, Northern Isles, Inverness, Ross, Cromarty, Sutherland, Caithness and Aberdeenshire. The regiment continues the warrior legacy of its ancestors in camouflage uniforms, deploying on multiple tours to both Iraq and Afghanistan, and now forms part of the Strike Experimentation Group under Army 2020. Amongst the legacies of the regiment are the black button spats, a style of the Gordon Highlanders worn by all battalions of the Royal Regiment of Scotland, and many of their traditions being upheld by the Aberdeen University Officer Training Corps, which also carries on the Gordon traditions of naming the pipe band the drums and pipes rather than the pipes and drums. Thank you for tuning in to this second and final part of the Gordon Highlanders, widely regarded not only amongst the finest of the Scottish regiments, but also of the British regiments. The Gordons distinguished themselves as a family regiment, bound close together by a north-eastern identity and for exemplary conduct wherever they were posted. The British Army is poor for the loss of this glorious unit of Scottish warriors. However, an excellent museum for the Gordon Highlanders exists in Aberdeen, and I cannot recommend paying it a visit enough. It has excellent exhibit and very friendly guides, many of them ex-members of the regiment, who have nothing but pride for the heritage and honour of the Gordon Highlanders. The next video in this series will cover some of the yeomanry regiments from Scotland, the notorious Lovat Scouts, Fife and Forfar Yeomanry, and the Scottish Horse. Please like and subscribe and share if you enjoyed this video, and leave a comment below.